great. So we can get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the iSamples 2015 Fall Webinar Series. iSamples, which stands for the Internet of Samples in the Earth Sciences, is an EarthCube NSF-funded research coordination network that seeks to dramatically improve the discovery, access, sharing, analysis, and curation of physical samples and the data generated by their study for the benefit of science and society. Our first speaker, Reyna Jenkyns from Ocean Networks Canada, will speak about the collection and digital curation of marine physical samples at Ocean Networks Canada. Doug Fills of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership will give the second talk about Open Core Data, a data infrastructure focused on making data from scientific continental and ocean drilling projects semantically discoverable, persistent, citable, and approachable. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, after which there will be approximately 10 minutes for questions. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box during the presentation or afterwards. We encourage questions of all types, so don't be shy, please. Reyna, we will begin with you. I will pass the screen sharing to you, and you may begin when you are ready.
Are you able to see the PowerPoint at this point?
Yes. Just make it full screen, and it looks great.
Okay.
Actually, now I'm seeing two screens now. It looks different than before.
Oh, is that better?
I'm seeing. Okay, that's great. Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So thanks for that introduction. Like was said, I'll be talking about our marine physical samples at Ocean Networks Canada. Just before I start getting into the physical samples, I just want to talk a bit about what Ocean Networks Canada is. Probably we're most famous for our cabled ocean observatories. Can you see the mouse? Is the mouse?
Yes, we can see the mouse.
Okay, so we have the Neptune Array cabled observatory off the northeast coast, in the Northeast Pacific off the coast of Vancouver Island, and also we have in the Salish Sea a smaller Venus observatory. But as you can see from this map, we're definitely expanding in terms of our infrastructure and our partnerships. So we also have a smaller observatory in the Arctic in Cambridge Bay. We're doing data management for an observatory in the Bay of Fundy. And as well, we're expanding up the coast of BC with other observatories in a program called Smart Oceans BC. And I expect in the next couple of years, we'll have more smaller observatories coming online and more partnerships as well. Just focusing in a little bit on the BC coast because this is where most of our infrastructure is and also where most of our sampling efforts occur. Just give you a better picture of what we have with the Neptune Array and in the Salish Sea. So if you have any questions about the observatory, I'm happy to answer more details later, but I just wanted to give a bit of context first. So basically we have numerous platforms that we use during our maintenance expeditions for the observatories, and this is when our sampling occurs. We use a variety of ROVs. We've used over 5 ROVs in the years that I've been working here. And we also have divers going out to some sites, like in Cambridge Bay, the shallower parts of the observatories, and they collect samples by hand. We have water samples collected by rosettes, like you see in the bottom picture here with the Niskin bottles. And then we also have sampling based on opportunity, so equipment that comes on board might have organisms attached, as well as other instruments that I'll talk about in other slides. So we basically have 3 types of samples. I'll talk about the biological ones first. So here this just gives a snippet of some of the types of sampling organisms that we've collected and sampling methodologies used, but it's only a small subsection. So we tend to have different ways to capture the organisms. So one way might be to have a baited trap seated on the seafloor while we conduct a dive with an ROV and then recover it at the end. We might also collect a sample directly with the ROV arm or a scoop or other apparatus on the ROV. And we'll be collecting individual organisms. It might be communities like tube worms at the bottom left from hydrothermal vent field. It might also be smaller organisms that might end up in our sediment samples, like invertebrates or smaller organisms captured that way. So there's a variety of means and mechanisms that we use to collect the samples and for a variety of purposes, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So we also have sediment samples and rock samples. This is just one of our most common types of sediment samples. It's the push core that's conducted using the ROV. So on the upper left, you can see the ROV arm taking a push core. Back on deck, we can tell the push cores apart because they have this colored tape, and this one is that I've shown here is one of our more elaborate tape markings, and I think it was because that was like the soccer championships were on at the same time, and so the various countries were being represented. And then we also show a push core after it's been taken out of the housing, and processing can start to begin at that point. We also get sediment samples from instruments like what you see here. This is a sediment trap, and this one is actually connected to our network. So that means that we can actually operate it remotely from shore throughout the year. And we can either operate it on a schedule, or it can be triggered manually by a scientist if there's an event or for any other reason. And then after recovery, the samples are finally processed to determine the fluxes of sediment and any concentrations of whatever might be of interest to the scientist. For the fluid samples, as I mentioned, we have the rosettes. So these are usually water samples taken in Niskin bottles. And you can see here a little bit of the process for collecting that sample, putting it into the jars, and doing some pre-processing. And actually we have these paper logs as one of the common forms to initially log the metadata. So that on its own is very challenging, and the challenging aspect of digital curation to go from these paper forms and make their way into a digital database. So that process should hopefully get streamlined in the future. And basically here we're looking at the concentrations of constituents in the water samples. We also will put Niskin bottles on the ROVs to be triggered at specific locations. And water samples may also be collected like this with, similar to the sediment sampler, we have water samplers that are connected to the network that can be remotely controlled and then later post-processed in a similar way. So this particular one is at the Main Endeavor field, which is part of the hydrothermal vents, and looking at what is the fluid outflow from these vents over time. So in general, that's just a very small subsample of the ways that we collect samples and the particular instances. So we have hundreds of samples of various, from the various cruises and instruments on the network. And then the reason we capture these samples varies as well. So in some cases it's for calibration, so to help confirm the oxygen readings on sensors is accurate, we might measure the oxygen concentration in a water sample. It may also be used for ground truthing to understand what is the organisms we're actually seeing in the video cameras, because we can't really know the exact taxonomy without the actual specimen. So this helps to confirm other specimens we might see in the video streams. There's a variety of scientific studies. I can't go in depth too much there because there's just such a variety. We're also looking at site characterization to understand the area where our instrumentation is better by characterizing the sediment samples, or just a better understanding of what makes up that ecosystem. And then there's also educational aspects to it where the students are on board learning how to sample by taking part in the various aspects like collection, processing, and analysis. So one example we had in our community newsletter today, we featured one of our student scientists who's here actually with us the last few weeks, and she's working on data from video and samples that were measured in the Arctic at Cambridge Bay. And so there's a link there. You can go look at what she's doing, but she's basically looking at a transect that was conducted with video and then characterizing the variability of the organisms, and she's looking at what's contained of invertebrates inside the sediment versus what's visible on the seafloor and looking at those relationships. The drivers for digital curation are a separate story because you could collect those samples for the various purposes and then not digitally curate them. So this is a big point that seems to come up again and again from our scientists and data partners, that we need to better represent all this information digitally so we have better access and we have better records. We also do have to produce reports, summaries for the cruises, and we also have to report back for the permitting that we get at the marine protected areas like Maine and Deverfield, and in other areas like Cambridge Bay, where we have to get special permits from the Indigenous communities. We also use these data and metadata to go into a special geodatabase that we've started to create for the marine protected area at Maine and Deverfield, and I'll show that application a bit later. And then furthermore, we need to better monitor all these metrics and the impacts of these samples for our funding agencies. And overall, this will help with our long-term data provenance for data reproducibility and reusability of the samples. So there's a lot to gain by taking care of this. Here's the concept that we've kind of laid out for where we'd like to go. The blue represents software or infrastructure that's managed by Ocean Networks Canada directly. Green would, and that's developed by Ocean Networks Canada. Green would be ones that we manage, but we don't necessarily create. And then the orange is sort of third party that we interface with, but we don't have any direct, we don't directly manage or directly contribute software to. So these are things like community standards that will drive our data model, agencies like IGSN for registering our samples and getting a unique identifier, the publishing agencies. And then we do use third-party products like ArcGIS for the database, interfacing with our internal database. We'll have a content management system for documents that we didn't create and we're just using. In this case, we use Alfresco. But then we have all our own tools. So I'll get into what I mean by C-scribe observations, but that's our dive logging tool with the ROVs. And then we have our own sample management interface for our metadata. We have a data search interface, which we have yet to extend to physical samples, web service calls that could be used by our own interface or external users, and then an archive directory for actual files of data. So this is our general roadmap to get to that full concept. So we are working on our metadata, data, and documentation management framework currently. And once we have that in place, we can migrate all those metadata records we've already collected into that system and improve them for completeness. We also have a lot of photos of specimens at the collection and recovery, and we need to better associate that with the actual sample metadata in the database and figure out better protocols for taking the images to make sure we have always like a ruler inside of the photo or the right lighting or the right ratios. So there's a lot to streamline in that process. As well, we need to better understand what documents we have and better organize them. So the protocols for processing, the MSDS sheets that might be needed for the agents on the ship, the equipment that was used to collect the samples. All these sort of documents should be associated. Then we need to have a way of getting back those measurements that we're taking from the physical samples. And these might be sent out to scientists outside of ONC that we have to draw back into our system. And then we have to, and as we send all these samples out, because we don't store them locally, we send them out usually to institutions like the Royal BC Museum, various laboratories, either at UVic, other universities. And so we need to keep track of where we sent them. We do to some extent, but we need to do a better job. And then we have to really define what is our workflow and make sure that we have a checklist that we always follow and so that we don't miss steps, which we already have for our instrumentation, so we can use that same tool and then extend it to the samples. We also have our dive logging tool, which helps us to maintain our syntax for when we're collecting samples in the field. And overall, we really need to work on our interface for finding the samples once we have them in our system. And that I don't have too many ideas of what that will look like at this point, but that will be a big effort once we get there. So basically, I just wanted to touch on a few things with the different types of samples. So with biological samples, we're looking at supporting OBIS. With sediment samples, we're looking to use IGSN identifiers. And with the fluids, we're really not sure. We haven't seen many standards out there for the samples themselves, although, of course, processing standards exist. But for the actual metadata fields, we're not really sure what is out there. Haven't really seen anything along those lines. So I just want to briefly show some aspects of our dive logging tool because this has been really a great way to track the actual collection of our samples. So we divide it into cruises and then our dives with an ROV, and then each observation is associated with a dive. These are used not just for the samples, but also for all our operations of our maintenance of our observatories and to characterize the seafloor and to just visually recognize organisms that we don't necessarily take samples of. And these annotations then help to better search through all our masses of dive video that we've collected and are made available to the end users in our Oceans 2.0 interface. These are some of the standards that we use that have some relevance to the samples. So our organism guide that we've created, and we're trying to start following this substrate classification, which may help in some of the metadata for samples like sediment and the rocks. Now our dive logging tool looks something like this. We have the list of cruises, or the list of dives with a cruise, and then the list of observations with a dive, and then each entry we have this drop-down menu option where we can have quick entries and have forced syntax on repeatable types of events. So we are already having strict syntax for sampling, but it's not necessarily containing all the fields that we'll ultimately want, so that needs to be improved. And this is where you can actually later go and see that video and with all the annotations again. So we need to tie this back into our metadata records of the samples as well. We have, like I mentioned, a workflow for instruments, and so each cruise or expedition we list every instrument that's affected, and so we could do a similar type of thing for our sample collection and then have the process that we need to go through for each sample that we collect and mark it off each field, each task as being complete or not required. And then here's an example of where we've actually had a data sharing success already. So some of our images have been shared with worms in their WORDS register of deep sea species and also in their app. So it's just a screen grab showing one of the images from our network. And this is an application that we've done for the MPA at hydrothermal vents, where we've, in addition to all our other dive metadata, we're also, and other metadata that we have in that area, we're including all our metadata associated with sampling. That's very important for the management of that MPA. So if you have any, if you'd like further follow-on to this, there are 2 posters that are involved with related physical samples at the AGU, and we have a booth, number 1236, and you can also contact me directly via email or look at our website for more info.
Thank you very much, Reyna. I think that we have just one question in the chat box, but I'm sure others have questions, so while I'm asking this one, please type them into the chat box. I believe you touched on this, Reyna, but can you talk a little bit more about the metadata schemas and or standards that you are considering using for describing physical samples?
So, like I mentioned, with it depends on the type of sample, but with the biological, we're planning to support the OBIS framework, which is a sub-entity of GBIF, and OBIS is specific to the marine organisms, and so that's the metadata framework that we're working towards supporting. For the fluid one, as I mentioned, I actually don't know of one. The best idea that we have is to represent the mechanism of the sampling, like the Niskin bottles or the water sampler, as devices, like their instruments, and associate the variables measured like sensors on instruments, and so basically curate them in much the same way as we do an instrument. although if anyone has better standards for fluids, I'd appreciate knowing. And for geological, we're in the midst of sorting through the various projects and entities that we'd like to be interoperable with and share our records with. So we don't have a final word, but we are looking at a few different programs. I had two identified in one of the slides. This one here. Yeah, there's the Marine Geoscience Data System. There's also the GPlace web portal, which is an interesting project that's taken sediment cores from the oceans and from numerous different, I think they have thousands of sediment cores that are used to characterize the substrate. And so there's different initiatives like that we'd like to support and contribute to. So we're just starting to identify exactly where we're going in that direction.
With respect to your use of IGSN, does Ocean Network Canada intend to become an allocating agent of IGSNs, or do you intend to obtain them from some place like CSAR, the System for Earth Sample Registration?
We're doing a pilot right now, and I think it probably would make sense to become an allocating agent, at least for our scientists, but I don't know more generally than that.
Okay.
That's something we should discuss, actually.
Certainly. Okay, well, I think that we can move on. Thank you very much again, Reyna. Doug, I'm going to pass the ball to you, and you can begin whenever you are ready.
Great, thanks. Okay, Megan, do you have my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Right.
Just make it full screen.
Yep, we'll get there.
Perfect.
All right, thank you very much. So my name is Doug Fills, and I'm one of the two people that are currently working on the development of the Open Core Data effort. And first, thanks for the opportunity to talk here with the iSamples group about the work that we've started here with OCD. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview, and I won't go into too much about the technical aspects of Open Core Data because I wanted to focus it more, I think, on some of those things that might be more relevant to the iSamples community. But as a quick overview, Open Core Data was developed in discussions between IEDA, CSDCO, and JRSO. So IEDA, of course, you know. CSDCO is the Continental Scientific Drilling Coordinating Office, and they work mostly with continental and lacustrine drilling efforts. And JRSO out of Texas A&M is the JOIDES Resolution Science Office, and they're the operators for the JOIDES Resolution, and they continue the long history of the deep oceans drilling from DSDP, ODP, IODP, and now the new IODP that they're coordinating. What in discussions with Kirsten and Anders, who are both part of this effort as well, and along with Brad Clement at JRSO, what we were looking at was a way that we could, one, put a layer of discoverability over the material that's coming out of both CSDCO and JRSO, and also allow then people to be able to search across the waterline for data coming from scientific coring. The association with IEDA then was a natural as well because of the need for identifiers, both DOIs and IGSNs, and also the need for some of the work that's going on there with connections to publications and things like that. So it was a very nice collection of interests and functional goals between those three groups. Currently, Open Core Data is supported as a supplement to the current IEDA proposal, and we do have a geoinformatics proposal in to NSF to continue this work then beyond that supplement. The diagram onto the right of the screen is really just a quick flow from facility data up through ingestion services in Open Core Data. It really just represents this process by which we would take information from the facilities and try and associate them with each other, both semantically and then also through the functional tools within the open core data system. But more interesting, perhaps, are the green spheres off to the side. And those represent those things that are really, one, key to the functionality of open core data, and I think key to data interoperability in general, things like unique identifiers, semantics, and things like this, but are things that are external to data project as I envision it, right? And that means that we would truly be able to start working on that web of data, right? Those connections between various facilities and organizations to leverage the work that's going on with the things like sample identifiers or other unique identifiers, archiving services, or semantics. And so that's a quick overview. I'll go into a little bit more detail as we go on. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the functional goals of open core data. Of course, one of them is to improve data discovery, right? We want to make data more discoverable, easier to find, and also ensure that we can locate it in the types of usable formats that researchers want. We also want to ease access to this information, right? Get it in file formats that people are interested in, and smooth the flow of that information into workflows that are currently being used, whether those be things like Excel, whether they be things like R or IPython notebooks, or elements like that. So we can do a lot of work in terms of data formats and things like that to provide that capacity. One of the things that we also want, and also very important, is citation of data sets, right? This is going to be something that's going to be more and more important in the years to come as we see mandates most likely coming down to cite your data, to have persistent identifiers on data sets so that they can be retrieved and associated with publications. The other thing that we're interested in is authority, right? Being able, and by that I mean being able to convey to the user of data where that data came from, right? So when a user obtains data via open core data, we want to make sure that they're aware of where that data originally came from. JRSO, CSDCO, maybe other organizations that we might work with, and then also the contact information further down through there. Sometimes people refer to this as provenance, and it could be viewed as a type of provenance, and therefore you could leverage some of the things that are going on with W3C Prov and things like that. But it's also kind of the authoritative source of the data, and so it's not necessarily exactly provenance in that area. Another important one is context, and by that I mean being able to convey along with the data what was meant by a certain measurement, right? What was meant when a certain parameter name is used. And so we're using semantics to convey along descriptions of parameters, descriptions of queries, and passing this on along then to the user in a machine-readable format. The last functional goal here I wanted to just briefly talk about is influence. And by influence, I mean, can we convey that information, convey data through OCD, through Open Core, into other groups like Neotoma or Magic or others that would be interested in the types of data coming from the facilities, and allow that then to be yet another vector for people to discover, so that they don't necessarily have to come to Open Core data in order to interface and access information that's associated or that comes from the facilities. So to reach these functional goals, we have certain enabling foundations then that we want to look at, so we can get a little bit more down in the weeds, right? So we are using vocabularies. We are using SCOS vocabularies locally. I am a co-PI in the GeoLink project, and so we are working on the OWL vocabularies, the OWL RDF that is being generated by GeoLink, and ways to connect these vocabularies or to leverage OWL and the GeoLink vocabulary directly is very important in providing this. And that plays into the semantics for both description and context and provenance and authority, as we've talked about in some of the functional goals. We're going to be using linked open data patterns. We've used these patterns in the past to publish some of the ocean drilling data, and we're leveraging that experience then in using those patterns now underneath the open core effort. Where needed, we will expose services and use APIs where necessary to make that data available, but we want to really focus on web architectural patterns to do that. Unique IDs are vital in this, both DOIs, IGSNs, potentially ORCIDs or others, as those keys that can be shared among various data providers, and as mentioned in the web architectural approach. And it's really viewed that as a community, the more that we can agree on these conventions and approaches, the more valuable they come to all of us. In terms of connections, as I mentioned, I'm a co-PI on GeoLink. Bob Arco there at Lamont is the lead PI on that project, and one of the things that we're working in there are things like data sets and samples and vocabularies to help describe those and expose that information. And so this provides a route to connecting to other data providers and places our local content, our local vocabularies we create in SCOFs, allows us to connect those into a larger context, right? A larger ecosystem of connected vocabularies or linked vocabularies. There are other semantic connections that we would be able to make then. There are efforts going on at CSIRO, for example, with geologic age and others. And in general, semantics and RDF as the data model underneath that makes for good keys, right? It makes for good agreed upon identifiers for things that we all call the same thing. But semantics doesn't always just have to be RDF graphs, right? There are machine learning efforts and networks of words and weighted relationships that also play into both utilizing semantics for discovery as well as user interfaces. There's a lot of potential. Open core data, as I said, is just getting started, but there's a lot of interest in how we could improve the influence of the data provided by the facilities, right? Obviously, something like an age model network that doesn't exist right now, but it's something that obviously open core data would have a lot of material to contribute to, and would be a very strong user of the resulting age models, right? To improve discovery of our resources and data sets. Obviously, there are apps. There's a new effort, NSF-funded effort called Flyover Country. That's interesting. The existing GeoMap app, many other apps, R or Python libraries, as mentioned, that are places where we could look for hooks in exposing open core data, right? And one of the most interesting to me then is what I've called community data services. By this I mean those domain or community specific databases like PaleoDB or Neotoma or Magic or others that serve a very focused community like the PaleoMag community or others. And there's a lot of data from the facilities, from both CSDCO and JRSO, that would be of interest to groups like this. And one of the goals of open core data is to make it easier for those types of data providers to consume and extract data from the facilities and place it into their local data environments, right? Now, when we do that, it's very important that we maintain the authority or the authenticity of that data back to the original providers, right? When people are consuming data out of Neotoma or Magic, we want to make sure that they know where that data came from, right? It keeps it in context. We want to be able to pass along the vocabularies so they can understand the terms and the types of searches and the meaning behind those searches that was implied by the scientists who originally did them in facilities. I have a small editorial at the bottom. I just have two of these. They're soapboxes, they're opinions. But one of the things is that as we look at building out these networks, right, as we see some of these EarthCube Integrative Activity Awards, both around paleo or the AIDA on. The question I think that we need to look at is, how do we grow this network of data? And how do we grow this interoperability in a sustainable manner, right? Are APIs a way for this? Are web architectural patterns a way for this? This is going to be a very important question. I personally think APIs can be difficult to maintain in something like this as they grow, as they scale up. But again, it's a soapbox, and I do think that we must be able to store and forward data with context and meaning around our community. So what are some of the interests? And I'm working my way towards things that I think are more directly relevant to iSamples. What are some of the interests or things that would be of great use to the open core data development process as it's undertaking right now? Of course, one of the ones that I was just talking about is, how can we expose data in bulk to consumers, whether that be applications, whether that be individuals, or whether that be other data providers like Neotoma or Magic? How can we do that in bulk, maintaining the context, maintaining the provenance, maintaining the authority backwards, so that when the consumer is looking at it, he or she knows where it came from and the description and the context of the terms and measurements and parameters and all those elements that are being used. And that's a big one. Obviously, a network of IDs is important, right? I've been very interested to watch the IGSN birth certificate process evolving and the metadata kernel that's associated with that. And I've been very excited to see how we could connect that in. Obviously, there are lots of sample IDs within both facilities, and making those associations with IGSNs that may exist already or ones that would come in the future is very important. And how would we do the resolution of those IDs and use those amongst the various data users, tools, to pass the type of information we need to maintain context of the data is very important. And I think that it's a very exciting process as well. So I just want to give you a quick then, here as we're coming towards the end, status of open core data and where we are in this. So we are currently working with a subset of the JRSO data, primarily the Janus data, and we have a representative sample of the CSDCO data as well. And we've been developing then the vocabularies around this, the SCOS vocabularies around the Janus and CSDCO data, and utilizing that then to create queries that can go across both collections and present that information. Also, as mentioned, we're involved with GeoLink, so we're very interested in seeing the process that's going on there with both data sets and samples and how that relates to things like the IGSN. We're exposing all our data using linked open data patterns. And we are then also currently using UUIDs for unique IDs for now because we can author those locally. Later, we would utilize DOIs, but because of the developmental nature of open core right now, while I've worked in the capacity to put in the DOIs and use them, we won't be minting any DOIs necessarily right now until things are more stable, both in terms of funding and our long-term vision for open core. We are also publishing using CSV for the web approaches from the W3C, combined with these linked open data patterns. And the CSV for web then also has metadata associated with it that allows us to expose that data both in JSON LD and RDF, right? Where the JSON LD is really just a representation of the RDF data model in that case. But it's nice because it allows us then to expose this information. And I should mention, and I'm wrong for not mentioning it already, that along all the stages here, we're addressing both machine-readable and human-readable approaches. And so the linked open data is obviously lends itself well to machine-readable patterns. We are using schema.org as one of the metadata formats embedded into the various pages that we're creating in the linked open data environment. So we have schema.org dataset as well as extensions in there for GeoLink. We're also generating geolink graph data along with this, as well as the CSV for web metadata. And the CSV for web metadata then allows us to generate out those RDF and JSON LD representations of the data sets. I've also been very interested in the lipid, the linked paleo data metadata effort that's gotten some interest from various people. And we have a lot of the elements in place now to begin publishing out lipid documents for our data sets and intend to do so. And we will incorporate GeoJSON into these various metadata elements as well. Again, as mentioned, we're building towards the data exchange so that we can make it easier for both tools and applications, as well as large community data providers to access in bulk data from Open Core. And there's been a lot of talk about things like hackathons and stuff like that. I'd be particularly interested in a providers hackathon, right? A data providers hackathon where we look at how can we pass data, how can we pass semantics, context, and identifiers back and forth among data providers, and then move it upwards to the user community or the tool community. And so one of the things we're working on then is quick and easy data harvesting with that context. It's all machine readable. Conversions of CSV plus metadata into other formats, as mentioned. We have APIs and Sparkle endpoints associated with these resources that we've created. And basically what Open Core Data is doing is moving towards a way to make it as easy as possible to publish and expose the data through as many means as possible with a cost-benefit analysis in there, of course. But maintaining and using semantics then to maintain the authority and provenance of that data so that it's not just lost out in the network as it moves from place to place. All the work that's being done in Open Core Data, it's available on GitHub, so all the source code is there if you're interested in looking at it. The website still is just a landing page for now. There are many pages hidden behind it, but I haven't exposed those simply because I don't want them indexed by Google or Bing or others. But if people are interested, I'd be happy to provide URLs and a guided tour of some of the things that are going on right now inside Open Core Data. The relevance to iSamples here then as we wrap up. Obviously, the establishment of IDs for samples and the ability to connect those through literature and other providers is a win for Open Core Data, right? And so how we develop a network that does that, that allows for the resolution of IGSNs, that allows for the exchange of data with those IGSNs in place is very, very valuable to Open Core Data, and I would love to be able to contribute to that, or I'd love to help out in that in any way that is of interest to people within this community. As mentioned, we talk about age models. Open Core Data is not the place for age models, but it is both a consumer and contributor to them. And so how we enable this flow of ages and the unique IDs that hook into these ages is of great interest to me. And in a lot of times when I think of things like IGSNs or other unique identifiers like ORCIDs or things like that, is I tend to think of an internet of trust, right? This ability to say, I know what this thing is, it has an identifier, and it becomes a key, like a key within a relational schema through which we can pass and exchange information with an agreement that something is what we think it is, right? And the last editorial, as I mentioned, is that this, I think everyone would probably agree that the age of the full stack is past. And by that I mean that no one effort, no one group can do everything that is necessary to bring data from the field all the way up through the researcher and into publication and linking it all. We've got to work as a web of data and providers into that web of data, and how we address this whole issue of if elements of that data go down, if elements of that web go down, the 404 fear, things like that, I think are very important for us to address. and resolve. So that brings me to the end. I'll be at AGU, the Thursday AM poster session for the Semantics for Discovery and Access, and I'd be happy to go over some of the more low-level technical details of open core data or other elements. As mentioned, Kirsten Leonard and Anders Noren are also involved in the geoinformatics proposal, and so they would be people to contact for information about open core data at a higher level, right, an institutional, architectural type level. And we would all be happy to ask any questions at all. This last graphic simply shows kind of a status of where we are. We have tools in red that you can find at GitHub that are consuming Janus and CSDCO data, as well as generating vocabularies and using those in the mix to create semantics that we load into both RDF, MongoDB, and relational databases. We are mixing in unique IDs in there, and would love to have that be something more than UIDs, but also things like DOIs and IGSNs as things evolve. And then we're exposing those through our architectural patterns, as mentioned, linked open data, CSV for the web, the various metadata formats and services. And again, underneath there are the tools in red that can be found at GitHub that are doing this effort. And then our next phase that we'll be working on is some of the user-facing elements, right? How do we expose this then to the users in a way that is, most useful to that community? And again, one of the user-facing elements I'll end on is that if we can drive more data out to tools and more data out to those domain-specific data resources like Magic, like Neotoma, like others, that's a win as well for that data. So, and I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Doug. That was certainly very informative. This seems like a really important project, and I'm excited that we were able to share this with more people today. So I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, everybody, but if you do have questions, please type them into the chat box. We have a very quiet crowd today, which I don't think is a reflection of the talks that we've heard. So I'm going to fill this space while you guys are thinking of your questions by making a little announcement. This, I think, relates to both of these efforts and to iSamples as a whole. We would like to let you know that we will be hosting a forum on physical samples at AGU on Sunday, December 13th from 4 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize that. If you go to the iSamples webpage, all of this information is there. And that will be the time where you guys can learn more about iSamples, more about the IGSN, how to use IGSNs, how to become a member of the implementation organization, more about CSAR. It's sort of a mixed bag from all of those three joint hosting constituents. So we hope to see you there. And with that,
I have a question.
Go for it.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's maybe a little too cumbersome to type. So my name's Natalie Latish. I work for the USGS in Denver, and we have the Core Research Center, and so we have tons and tons of files of data that have been contributed for our cores for the last, well, since probably 1974. And so a lot of our files don't necessarily have the laboratory standards. We know what cores they were sampled for, which cores were analyzed at what depths and things like that. And so I've been struggling with how do we make the data relevant, for 30 years of data, how do we not lose all those data? And I'm wondering, do you, Doug, have any insights into those kinds of legacy data sets that may still be relevant among all of these different core repositories?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and really, I think initially, of course, Open Core is keeping its scope to CSDCO and JRSO, and I've worked with the IODP data for some time, and so it's much easier for me to wrap my head around it. But some of what you're talking about is probably more relevant to like what's going on at CSDCO, right, where we have lots of flat files, we have lots of different formats, and the question is, how do we start to interconnect those various data sets with something, right? With something that we can get a handle on to expose to users, right? And the key thing with CSDCO is we're going to be trying to mark up the location information and the metadata around the expeditions or the projects that were involved in those, using those then as kind of identifiable resources, things that we can associate, if nothing else, a URI within the linked data scope, and maybe potentially a DOI or some other type of resolvable unique identifier, and then attaching documents to that, right? Trying to build a network in which we can get those flat files online, maybe using, at a low level. One of the reasons we chose MongoDB is that it has GridFS in it, and so we can place blobs in it, whether they're PDFs, whether they're images, whether they're Apple Core, or any these other types of maybe unknown binary formats, but we want to keep that legacy there, and then trying to make that connection with it. It's a struggle, it really is. And it's one of the things that we're really trying to see if we can at least just come up with some ideas initially and test them out. They may not work, but some of the experiences that you've had would be very valuable to look at and see. So I'd love to get in touch with you some more if we could. Yeah,
absolutely. Maybe I'll come by AGU, if the government doesn't shut down, and speak with you. But yeah, because we're thinking along the same lines. We've even thought about looking inside the files themselves and assigning some control vocabulary so that at least people are able to find porosity measurements, things like that, because we get those kind of questions all the time, and we don't have enough information about the actual data and what the files contain to tell them, okay, these cores have the measurements that you're looking for. So yeah, I'll get in touch with you. So thank you very much.
No, and I agree. And you know what? It sounds like a total hack, but one of the things that I've done is when you look at a document like that, one of the things you can do is just simply throw away all the numbers, right? And then anything that's left over, the words that are left over, you can index and look at and use as keywords or things like that. Surprisingly, in some cases, that can do a really good job. The other thing that I've been looking at is NCSA's Brown Dog. And I don't quite know enough about Brown Dog yet. Brown Dog is still in development, but it looks like a type of approach for this kind of introspective look at documents like that, and then providing keywords and metadata about them. So that might be something of interest to you as well.
Okay, thank you.
Doug, this is Jim Bowering. Hey, so in that same vein, what about modifying Deep Dive to have a look at these things?
Yeah, no, you could. There's a lot going on with things like that and other machine learning type approaches too. That could go in and analyze a document and generate out keywords, or maybe even give a weighted estimate of what's in the document or what's associated with the document. That's another good idea. And one of the things I'd like Open Core Data to do is be that kind of engine that allows something like a Geo Deep Dive or a Brown Dog or whatever tool is down the line, to be able to come and ingest these documents quickly and efficiently in a machine manner, and then do a value add to that. And if that value add can flow back into Open Core Data, all the better.
All right, everybody, thanks for the participation. Lots of great questions. We are nearing the hour, so I would like to close by letting everyone know that these webinars will be archived on the iSamples YouTube channel and linked to the iSamples website for future viewing, so you can tell all your friends that weren't able to make it today. Our webinar series will be back in the new year, potentially in collaboration with the C4P Collaboration in Cyber Infrastructure for Paleogeosciences Research Coordination Network. You should check our website for upcoming events. Thanks, everybody, and have a nice evening.